So, thank you everyone for joining the webinar series or the lecture series organized by InCHIP. My name is Debs Kosh. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography at UConn. By training, I'm a health geographer, and currently I work in the field of health disparities, looking into neighborhood impact, the structural and the interaction of structural and social determinants of health on cancer, risk, prevention, and burden. It is my pleasure, very, very good, excited about introducing Dr. Jennifer Roberts to you all. Dr. Roberts is an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology, School of Public Health at University of Maryland, College Park. Among the many accomplishments and accolades she already has, I'm going to mention two key accomplishments that Dr. Roberts has been doing and being recognized a lot about that. So, Dr. Roberts is the founder and director of the Public Health Outcomes and Effects of the Built Environment Lab, which she has a cool acronym, PHOEBE, and she's also the co-founder and co-director of NatureRx at UMD. So this NatureRx UMD is an initiative that emphasizes the effect of green space and their benefits on well-being and physical activity. But interestingly, she looks into these green spaces at UMD, in and around UMD, but also acknowledges the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, as well as the historical slave trade legacies of the UMD campus land. She has received several recognition for this initiative. Her overall scholarship focuses on the impact of built, social, and natural environments on different public health outcomes, but more specifically, currently her research focuses on the impact of these built environment factors on physical activity and active living. And today she's going to be talking about, right into her current research, impacts of built, social, and natural environments. So with that, I will move it over to Dr. Roberts, but I'm going to mention a couple of things here for the audience. You are all muted. However, if any questions that come up to your mind while you are listening to her talk, please feel free to type that in the chat box. But at the end of her talk, you will also get an opportunity to unmute yourself and then ask the question directly to our speaker. We always encourage that because that allows more engagement with our speaker and the audience here. So with that, I'm going to give it over to Dr. Roberts, and a very well welcome to you for this webinar.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Deb. I'm so pleased to be here. I want to thank you all for inviting me and thank everyone on behalf of InCHIP for having me be one of your speakers. And I'll get right to it. So I like to always start off with this introduction because a lot of my work, most recently, I'll say in the last couple of years, has been focused on my hometown of Buffalo, New York. Even though I've lived in all these other different towns and I currently live in Baltimore, Buffalo, I'll always be a Buffalo girl at heart. And it's a place that will just, basically always be home. So today I will be talking about, some of the environmental impacts that Deb had mentioned that I studied on public health. But I like to kind of start a little bit with a kind of like a little snapshot, quick history recap. And I like to do that just so that we're all on the same page. And I do this a lot, particularly if I have a lot of international people in the audience. So, and then also folks, who've been born and raised here, to kind of just do a really, really quick snapshot. And so thinking about our country, which is still, if you think about it, very relatively young country, so much of it was things that were not that great in the sense that, yes, it was great that, quote, this country was created, but a lot of that came about because during the age of dispossession. And we sometimes kind of overlook those impacts, those negative impacts of that, where it was very much brutality and all the other implications that occurred with indigenous communities having to pretty much surrender their lands. And the other aspect about it is there was kind of a perpetual kind of mythology that was sent among the colonizers, is that, these lands were for the taking, that they were much unoccupied. And what we learned that, that was not the case. And they had this quote unquote Indian problem, which incurred many other different implications of ethnic cleansing and just killing. I mean, just so many other aspects, reservationizing folks, and just many other things. And a lot of this was done for quote unquote the goodness of creating our national parks. So that's one piece, like I said, a very quick snapshot. Also, during this time, we had another marginalization of just millions and millions of Africans who were brought here to quote unquote build the country, really just their free labor to pretty much just help with the building of the country. And with that, there was much more brutalization and many other exploitation. And then I often say this was a period of land exploitation because we just churned and churned and churned and grew cotton and really kind of like exploited the soil, and just to the point where it was almost ungrowable at periods. And then we exploited the Black bodies during this time. And even though there was this period where, okay, we have Emancipation Proclamation around 1863, there still continued. It wasn't like, oh, everything was all great. It still continued to have this quote unquote Negro problem, because you had this large population of people who were basically, kind of stuck. They didn't have a place to live. Some of them didn't know how to read and write. And so you had this perpetual kind of impoverishment and more further disenfranchisement of these quote unquote freedmen, who were now kind of stuck to live in a situation where, yes, they were quote unquote emancipated, but they weren't free. And a lot of this continued on. I say, like, you had the 400 years of enslavement, but there was just another hundreds of more years, in the sense that you had these other aspects where folks were not actually emancipated. And one of those things were operationalized through Black codes. And so these are basically laws that, in a way, was to ensure that you had continued cheap labor. And so even though throughout the southern states, the Black Belt, so to speak, where you had these fertile states and where they grew cotton and tobacco, you had a situation where every state kind of created their own kind of Black codes. And many of these codes were arbitrary. But one of the most common Black codes throughout all of the states was one of vagrancy. And so this meant that if you were over the age of 18 and you didn't have a job, or specifically a labor contract, then you could get arrested. And then if you got arrested, you would not really be tried by your peers, but you could actually get swept into a convict leasing program, which I will actually mention momentarily. But this made it so that people were forced to be sharecroppers, because it's not like you could be like, oh, I'll go find a job elsewhere. Because meanwhile, you had a lot of white Southerners who were very angry. They're angry that they lost the war, angry that you had these emancipation, angry now that, how am I going to get my free labor? So you had situations where, these quote unquote free Black people were not necessarily welcome. So one and only one of option really was sharecropping. And so with sharecropping, this was a system that actually was a very brilliant agricultural system, because you had a former enslaver who was the landowner, who was like, where am I going to get all my labor from? And then you had all of these Black bodies who were like, well, where am I going to get a job? Or where am I going to live? More importantly. And so instead of receiving wages, they would receive a portion of the harvest at the end of the season. And so you had a situation where they could still live, on the land, but instead of, paying rent, or instead of, buying food, they would basically borrow against their future harvests. So it was really a perpetual state of poverty, because what you had was a situation where people were like always in the red, because at the end of the harvest, you may not have yielded as much as you thought, or prices may have gone up. There was a lot of price gouging. There's a lot of different situations where the quote unquote sharecropper was not going to come out, in the black. But like I said, if you weren't a sharecropper and you didn't have a labor contract, and you were found to not have a labor contract, you could get arrested. And which once you were arrested, you could be sentenced to these long, extraordinary sentences. And part of this was due to what was happening with the convict leasing program that was going on in many southern states. And so you had courts and counties and judges who all had these labor contracts with financial incentives that they would receive. And these contracts were with railroad companies, steel companies, mining companies. Because as you recall, they're coming out of a war during this Reconstruction period. And they need to rebuild the South, and because it was very much dismantled. So they need that free labor. And so you would have, the judge say, well, to the railroad company, well, how long is your job and how many men do you need? And they're like, well, we need 50 men and it's probably going to be a 6-month job. So all of these quote unquote prisoners coming in who, like I said, may not have even had either very innocuous crime or no crime at all, they would get sentenced to 6 months. And it all would happen literally in one day. Like there are stories where you have family members who are like, my husband, my brother left for the day and never came back home. And that was because they were arrested, sentenced, tried, and then put out to the field to do the work. This happened well into the 60s. And then in addition to that, you had, like I said, many, many, many white Southerners who were still very angry of all of the situations that was happening. And during this time, white supremacy really was rampant. And it was this whole reign of terror that just was maintained pretty much from groups like Ku Klux Klan, also that were supported by the state government. And so you had this proliferation of lynchings that occurred. The proliferation of lynchings not only occurred, but they occurred in a very racialized way. So lynching was always kind of a part of the quote unquote judicial system, so to speak, particularly when you had like rural areas where you couldn't necessarily go downtown to court. People had to kind of like, kind of self-regulate themselves or uh, self kind of punish, so to speak, people who did things, whether it was like, thieves or a swindler or something small, but it wasn't necessarily where people would get killed. It was like, people would kind of get roughed up. Sometimes it did get more violent, but it wasn't the way it was until after Reconstruction period or during the Reconstruction period, where it became much more racialized and it became much more of a terrorized murder. And we can see that it was like almost a 5-to-1 increase in terms of the Black to white lynchings that happened, in the late 1800s. And then after 1900, it increased almost fivefold. So it was really like this kind of more racialized and a much more deadly characterization of lynching that happened. And so with all of that, with the sharecropping, I'm always impoverished. With the Black codes, I can't necessarily marry who I want to marry, or I can't own land, or all these other random Black codes. And then the terror of lynching, a lot of people basically said, oh, and I also wanted to mention that the lynchings often were a public spectacle. And so they would happen in these natural environments, on farms and forest, all these other natural environments where it became a situation where a lot of Black Americans kind of had this land-based trauma associated with lynchings. You hear the song "Strange Fruit" and hanging from poplar trees. Like that is a very much about nature and natural, but it's a terrorized account of nature. And so these are things that started to kind of characterize the relationship that Black Americans had with natural environments. So I say all of that because the buildup in terms of people started to leave the South. People started to leave the South in droves. They were leaving it because of these poor economic and social conditions. And so you have what is known as the Great Migration that occurred roughly between 1910 and 1970. This is the largest internal migration that's occurred in this country, where you had over 6 million Black Americans leave, and they went to cities in the Northeast, they went to cities in the Midwest, and then during like the second migration, because they followed like two different kind of periods, more people were going out west towards California. But in any case, people were leaving because of the fact that they wanted to try and achieve a better life. And so one of those cities was my hometown of Buffalo. Now, what's interesting is Buffalo actually was already a place that you had some Black Americans that were going to, because it was on the way to Canada when a lot of folks were leaving to try and achieve some freedom during the period of enslavement. But then after emancipation, you had almost 145% increase of the Black population. And then another significant increase during those two waves of the Great Migration that I just mentioned. So during the first wave, you had almost one year, almost a 200% increase of the Black population. And then during the second wave, another doubling of the population. All in all, the population between 1940 and 1970, it grew over 400% for Black Americans. But what's interesting, during this latter part, we see that the white population in Buffalo decreased by 50%. And what's interesting is that they didn't necessarily leave, the greater Buffalo, Niagara area or the state. They just left the actual inner city and went to suburbs, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But what's also interesting is right before this migration period and after the Emancipation Proclamation, we saw this significant green space transformation that Buffalo underwent. And one of the reasons why this happened was there was so much fanfare that happened right after the unveiling of Central Park. And so many cities that were quite prosperous, and Buffalo was at the time was like the 10th largest city and one of the wealthiest cities at the time. Everyone wanted their own like Central Park. And so Buffalo invited Frederick Law Olmsted to the city. The park planners or the park envisioners wanted to invite him, and they were like, can you create our own, Central Park? And so Frederick Law Olmsted, he came to visit the city. And when he went and he visited the city, they had laid out the red carpet for him and they were showing him around. And they were like, this could be a great place and this could be a great place. What he ultimately said was that this is the best planned city, with regard to the streets, public places, and the grounds. And so he said, you guys don't need just one park, you need a coordinated park system. And so Buffalo became the first city that had this coordinated park system. And we're forever known as this city with the moniker of the best planned city. Incidentally, it's very interesting. Our layout is almost identical to Washington, D.C. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., it's very perpendicular in terms of, perpendicular. I forget which is the longitude, latitudes, but you have the number streets, and then you have the alphabet streets, and then diagonal, you have the state streets. And we're almost identical to that. And it's incidentally because the Ellicott, who designed DC, Andrew Ellicott, his younger brother, Joseph, basically just copied and pasted his older brother's layout and did Buffalo. But in any case, that's a little bit of trivia. When Frederick Law Olmsted said, okay, you know what? I know what exactly I want to do. I think right here, we should first this is going to be the centerpiece of the emerald necklace. And this will be a great place. You already have a meadow there. The meadow is about 150 acres. So we can just use this. I'll add some kind of pastoral effects to it. But this will require very little landscaping. Then he said, okay, I want to have a park next to the water. Because at this time, you have to remember, the working class people lived along the water. Buffalo is a very hydroelectric industry at the time. And we were going to have the Erie Canal. And there was so much that was very much hydroelectric, also with Niagara Falls, being quite adjacent. So he was like, let's have a park near the people, like the working class people. And then also a park where people could do waterfront activities. Then he said, okay, I want a third park called the Parade. This is going to be a park where, we can do military drills and we could have kind of parades. And it was kind of those things where he was, granted, we're still kind of like about 10, 15 years out from the Civil War. So they're still kind of thinking about that kind of military centric kind of thinking. And so that's why he called it the Parade. But years later, his sons, they basically changed it and added in a wading pool. And this wading pool was the largest wading pool in the country. And it was for the children and for everyone to have some kind of merriment in terms of swimming. And they changed the name of the park to Humboldt Park. And then years later, in the 70s, that wading pool was removed, but then the park was then changed to Martin Luther King Park. But in any case, these were like the main parks that Frederick Law Olmsted had initially planned. And he said, I want to make it so we have a city within a park. So you don't ever leave a green space. So even though you had the main parks, he had these parkways, which would connect all of it, hence the name Emerald Necklace. And so he wanted to make sure that if you left the park, which is now called Delaware Park, you could walk all the way through Humboldt Parkway and get to the parade. And then the same way on the other side with the other parkways. And what's interesting, though, is when he designed it, Buffalo was more integrated. Like I said, you had the working class living by the water. And so it was much more integrated. You had German immigrants living with Black migrants who were coming up from the South after the Great Migration. You had just much more integration in terms of along racial lines. Yeah, it was just separated along class lines, but in terms of racially, it was much more integrated. But over the years, we had a significant segregation that occurred right along the Main Street line. That is like the hard demarcation in terms of the west side of Buffalo and the east side. And this is how Buffalo looks today. And this is how it's looked for the longest time in terms of the segregation, where 80% of Black Buffalonians live on the east side, but as indicated by all of this green. And then on the west side, it was mostly all blue, but over the past, I would say 20, 30 years, we've had more influx of Asian and Hispanic residents. And so that's why you see this on the very, very western side. But in any case, the east side has pretty much stayed the same in terms of its 80% Black Buffalonians. And the question is not so much like why, but more of a question of like, well, how did this happen? Like, these things don't just necessarily happen by accident. Like, these were deliberate kinds of things that kind of churned kind of the wheel so that the city became segregated. And there are many different policies and practices that went in place. I'm not going to go through all of these, but they were all kind of working in tandem together to kind of create the city that was segregated. And Buffalo's not alone. You have many other cities that are maybe just as segregated, if not to some degree or more. But in any case, Buffalo has always been known as a very segregated city since I've been born. And so one of those features was redlining. Redlining is something that, many cities have experienced, but we see this where with redlining, you had the systematic investment in areas that were highly regarded, but they were also white neighborhoods. And you had areas that were much more disinvested, which were usually areas of communities of color. And what's interesting about redlining is it's like two different functions that kind of operationalize the actual quote redlining. So it was first the creation of the maps. And so after the Great Depression, we had the New Deal where Roosevelt said, okay, we need to figure out how to keep people in their homes. First of all, like that's the biggest thing. There was foreclosures that was happening left and right. So he created the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And their primary goal really was to reimagine the mortgage. Mortgages beforehand were not amortized. Like they were the worst things ever. They weren't like 30 years. They weren't low rate. The interest rates, they were just very poorly structured. You were almost set up to foreclose or default. So he restructured that and he said, we're going to have these low interest mortgages. That was like really the own main function. And then they were like, okay, well, you know what? Here's like a little side project. Why don't we just launch this city survey program, a little side project? And so HLC pretty much launched this program, and they said they deployed some field agents out to about 235, 39 cities to basically look around, interview folks, interview local lenders, interview banks, and figure out which areas were a little bit more risky or less risky to default on a mortgage. The problem with that is they didn't just say, oh, the housing stock is poor, or these are features in the environment, there's a train right here. It wasn't just about the physical environment. They designed the risk levels based on who also lived there, and that was designed on racial lines. So if you had communities of color, it was going to be maybe yellow, definitely red. If you had communities that were white, and not just white who were born in the United States, so not immigrant white, but white born in the United States, those would be green. So they created these maps, and they were like, okay, great, here's the maps. It really wasn't until the FHA came along and basically now started to really kind of operationalize what these maps meant. Now, they created their own maps too. claim that the maps got lost in a fire, what have you, but basically their maps were copy and paste of the HOLC maps. But what's really, really important, what they did was they were now in charge of not necessarily keeping people in their home and helping them not foreclose. These were the people who were going to help you actually buy a house, which was another key thing that Roosevelt wanted. So they needed to figure out how we're going to figure out how you're going to have these economically sound loans that people won't default on. Now, the key thing is you had a lot of banks who were like still scared because we're coming out of depression. And so what you have when you have the FHA saying, look, banks, look, lenders, you don't have to be scared because we are going to insure them. So when you have the federal government say, you know what, we got your back, then the banks are like, oh, okay, that sounds good. But you have to abide by every single rule we say. And all these rules are in this underwriting manual. And so this underwriting manual, which you actually can now pull down from 1938 and literally read it, it's a thick manual. It goes from A to Z on what they will and will not insure. So specific. And one of the things they talk about is how you can even use natural physical barriers to kind of protect a neighborhood that's already highly regarded. They state you can have naturally or artificially established barriers to prove effective in protecting a neighborhood and the locations within it from adverse influences. They even go on to say what those adverse influences are. This is to prevent the infiltration of businesses and industrial use. So yes, okay, you kind of can understand that with a little bit of zoning, you don't want like a pig farm next to your house. But they even go on to say, oh, lower class occupancy and inharmonious racial groups. It's that explicit. And then they give you examples of how you can use these barriers or what these type of barriers are. It could be a public park, it could be a hill, or it could be a ravine, or even other instances, it could be like a main thoroughfare, like Main Street, as you see on this security map from Buffalo, where you see Main Street is kind of like separates. This is that main park, that centerpiece park that Olmsted had designed. And you can see how it's kind of like enclosed with green and blue. And then you have this thoroughfare as a barrier against the red and most of the yellow over here. And so it talked about just that. And so what would happen is banks would use this and say, okay, well, if you're in this area, green or blue, I'll definitely give you a mortgage. I'll give you a great mortgage. Whereas areas in red and yellow, they weren't not going to be guarded with mortgages. And so in Buffalo, like this is an example of an area that's green line next to the park that I mentioned. Who's in it? Well, basically, well, first of all, it's beautifully landscaped and has parks, but there's no foreign born, there's no Negro, and there's no infiltration. That was also key. That's how you kept it protected. You needed to keep it insulated, like almost this barrier to make sure you did not have infiltration. Whereas this red-lined area, it had 5% Italian, 95% Negro, and definitely an infiltration of Negro residents. So another aspect that perpetuated the residential segregation was urban renewal. Now, after World War II, you had this kind of suburbanization boom. And along with suburbanization, you had to have automania, because how are folks going to get back and forth? So you had this dual thing where people are going out into the suburbs to move. And when I say people, specifically white residents are going out into the suburbs because they're able to use their GI Bills from, folks coming in from servicemen coming in from World War II. And so you also need a car because you need to traverse from downtown to the suburbs. But also you started to think, oh, gosh, I really wish I had a more efficient way to get from downtown to the suburbs. So you had this interstate highway project. This was a project that was kind of always sort of in the making, but we just didn't have money. But I'm gonna get to that in a minute. So with the interstate highway project, you had kind of pairing with urban renewal grants. Before I go on any further, I want to kind of just do this, like I call it my little commercial break, where I go back to focus specifically on Humboldt Parkway. This one right here on the right. This is y'all, this is how it looked. First of all, let me go back to this. You see this parkway? It's the longest. It was the most grandest of the parkways compared to the ones over here on the west side that Olmsted had designed. It's 2 miles long and it's 200 feet wide. And Olmsted was very particular. He wanted 6 rows of trees that had this Broadway that you could just literally walk down the middle and go from one park to the next. So it was gorgeous. It was stunning. I never saw it because it was already destroyed by the time I was born. But my mom always talks about walking from the parks to park with her sister and brother. So in any case, I just wanted to do that commercial break so you can see how beautiful it is. Okay, I'm gonna go back to this other aspect of the Interstate Highway Project. I hope you're understanding I'm trying to do a build up of the story. But in any case, the Interstate Highway Project was always something that, the United States thought that would be great. There was a Federal Highway Act that was passed in 1944, but there was no money earmarked for it. So how are you going to build like a whole highway system throughout the whole country and you don't have any money? Anyhow, by the time Eisenhower was president, who really was kind of like the campaigner for the Federal Highway Act ever since he was a lieutenant back in the war when he went to the Autobahn in Germany. He was like, this is something we need to have. And if I ever become president, I'm going to make sure we get one. So he's president. And then when the 1956 Act was passed, it basically said, okay, listen, to everybody who wants a highway, we're going to cover 90% of it. So basically, it's like all cities were like, you get a highway, you get a highway. And then if you want to get that last like 10% covered, just get an urban renewal grant. And so these urban renewal grants, it wasn't just for, highway placement, it was also for other big public works projects. But they often were used in tandem with highways because they were a way to, quote, redeem urban areas. If you look at many of the like DOT or highway administration, they actually have these words to talk about how if you place a highway in certain areas, it will help kind of get rid of the areas that were like the single greatest element that would cure the ills of the city. And so they often talk about, if these highways can help get rid of slums, and they were not slums, they were just areas that had been habitually disinvested because most of them were redlined or yellow lined. So they said, no worries, if you want to kind of clear that up and remove all of that, we'll just put in a highway. So when Buffalo was thinking, oh, we can get this highway now, they were like, where should we put the highway? Do we want to put it over here on the west side or do we want to put it on the east side? And so as the buildup, when the city's already starting to become much more segregated, many more Black Americans are living on the east side, they decided, how about we just kind of excavate this entire Humboldt Parkway and we'll put in the highway right over here. It was over a 20-year project. This is an aerial photo of the parkway. I always say this is a really kind of unique photo because most photos in Buffalo are covered in snow. And so you see the full foliage where you see how beautiful the parkway is. And then over time, now mind you, they had to cut down 2 miles worth of trees, 6 rows, across, and then excavate the trunks. And then also they had to excavate even further because this highway was sunken in a depressed highway. And so this is why it took so long. And what ultimately happened was you had a bifurcation of the community that was living there, which was the Black community. And it really was a devastating loss because you lost this significant green space, this kind of treasure that a lot of people had, where you were able to kind of like have a connection. You could walk across the parkway to go see your neighbors. Now that was no longer an option. This is kind of photo. I really love this photo because it really shows you how something as simple as in 1950, you could actually walk from one side of the street to go to your neighborhood deli, get something to eat, go see your neighbors. And so you could patronize, in community businesses and then walk back home. Where now with this expressway, they can no longer have walk-up traffic. You can no longer walk across the street to see your neighbors or to, patronize that deli. And so you really see not only nature inequities, but many other social inequities that came about with the intrusion of this highway. So there's many human health benefits that I won't even go into all of them, but there's physical health benefits, there's social health benefits, and there's mental health benefits. And that's why I'm a proponent of access to nature. But we've seen this actually really start to come to surface during the first year of the pandemic, where we started to see that nature deprived areas were mostly in communities of color, which makes sense because most of the communities of color were historically redlined. And those are the areas that were disinfested. Those are the areas that did not get the tree lined streets. Those are the areas that did not get the exquisite parks or the upkeep of parks. So we started to see this connection between where people lived and whether or not they were living in nature deprived areas. And again, Buffalo is an example of that. And so here we see Buffalo, where Buffalo, they received about a 76 score in terms of the park score index. This is a score that basically is a score based on how much acreage do you have for parks, how much is the access, how much have you invested, what are the park amenities, and then the equity. And so the higher the score, the better. And so Buffalo overall got a 67 or 66.9. But when you look specifically just at the equity construct of the score and of the equity construct specific portion that looks at park space distribution, the score is only a 35 out of 100. And what that's saying is residents living in communities of color, so specifically the East Side, have 50% less nearby park space than those living in white neighborhoods. We also see inequities with regard to trees. This is very easy to interpret. You see a whole lot of green on the west side of Main Street and a whole lot of orange on the east side. And I put two identical maps up to each other so we could compare like two different census tracts. So one is a 99 and one is a 67. Those again are tree equity scores. And basically those scores are showing how much canopy cover is needed. So this score with a 99, they're like, oh, you already almost achieved. You're only like missing 2%. So it's a very low priority to address that. Whereas the score of 67, you have only achieved about 50% of your canopy. But what's interesting, the scores are not just about you have trees or you don't have trees. It's about who also lives in those census blocks. So that also goes into whether or not it's a high or a low or the highest priority. So the one that has a score of 67, you see it's 100% people of color, 20% unemployment, and a 75% poverty. Whereas the other one, it's only 13% poverty, 4% unemployment, and 13% people of color. So how does this translate to active living inequities? Because I call it active living because to me, I feel like active living is a much more attainable, understandable, relatable phrase than physical activity. I mean, people get physical activity, but I think people start to immediately think it's structured. You're going into the gym, you're doing all these physical kind of structured classes and everything. But active living, to me, in my opinion, is really how we are able to achieve our needed minutes of movement per day. Again, I put this up because I wanted to show a close relationship between physical activity and nature. So typically when you're out in nature, you're more likely to move. That's just how it is. It usually goes hand in hand. And also you're more likely to move longer. I don't know if anyone is a runner. I used to run. I used to hate running on treadmills when I was like training for like a race or something. So I hated training in the wintertime because a lot of times you had a treadmill. We're outside, you're like, oh, we already at 3 miles. Like, okay, no, but it's not always like that. But you still have more beautiful things to see, and it was just a better, more enjoyable run. So when we again look at Buffalo, we see on the east side of Main Street that it's all blue, except for a few little red spots. So when all blue is showing that it's low walkability, which makes sense because you have a highway going through there. But also low walkability means that you don't have sidewalks, you don't have sidewalks that have a adequate width, you don't have good quality sidewalks. Whereas on the west side, it's red and you have high walkability. Looking at bike. So the map on the left, it shows a very intricate biking network where you have bike lanes and just a very intricate network to make it very much easier to bike on the west side. Whereas on the east side, you have much less biking network and a piece of it is right along the highway, which is number 33. So it's not a great option in terms of biking. And then incidentally, the 4 main bike shops are on the west side, which makes sense. You go to where your customers are. Same thing with bike racks. Most of them are on the west side because that's where most of the cyclists are going to be. So you kind of see where I'm going in terms of the active living inequities. So when you have this inequities and these compromised conditions of how you live, eventually you're going to see health disparities. You're going to see these health outcomes that have disparate outcomes. And in this case, disparate outcomes all along racial, which also are spatial lines, but racially distributed as well. So this is a map that talks about health burden of poor and physical mental health. It was self-reported. I wish they would have used different colorings because it's not as significant, but it is significant in the sense that it's darker blue on the east side than it is on the west side. But again, let's look at two different census blocks. So we see one is 20 and one is 72. So again, this one is 20 is saying that they have pretty much 3 times less burden than the census block on the east side. One of those is asthma. So this is very easy to interpret. You see all this red that is on the east side. You see a little bit of the red on the west side, but pretty much the whole entire east side is red. And this is telling you is that these folks are in the 95th to 100th percentile for asthma prevalence. This is not in comparison to the west side. This is not comparison to the state. It's compared to the entire United States. And then also we see a large swath of low life expectancy. So you see here, again, the red represents 95th to 100th. And then the orange, it's not that much better. Like the orange is basically 90 to 95th. And again, in the low life expectancy percentile in terms of compared to the rest of the United States. So some next steps in terms of what's happening in Buffalo. This kind of goes to a little bit of my environmental justice advocacy work. So 2 years ago, I was on sabbatical and I'm writing a book about this. And when I went to Buffalo to kind of like, do interviews of people who've lived in Buffalo, and it's about their time living with Humboldt Parkway. And I knew there was some thought about what are we going to do next, because the age of the highway has exceeded its state of maturity. The retaining walls are falling down. And so the Department of Transportation has to do something. And so there was some kind of rumblings about, DOT might put a cap on a portion of the highway and have a little tunnel. And then on top of that cap, there will be some like trees and they'll have a little bit of green space. And at first blush, I was like, oh, okay, that might be kind of a cool option. And so I'll tell you more about that in a second. But I started to think about what would have been like if we never got rid of the Humboldt Parkway? And then I started thinking, well, what would it be like if we completely decommissioned the expressway and we completely restored Humboldt Parkway as close as the way Olmsted had envisioned it? And then I started to read, you have Rochester and Syracuse and other sister cities who are starting to decommission some or portion of their highways. Like that is a possibility, because Buffalo, like many Rust Belt cities, has had a significant decrease in population. When I was a kid, I was born in 1974, and the population was almost 600,000, if not, well, a little under 600,000. Now it's under 300,000. So you're talking about a population that cut in half, which means we do not have the same vehicular burden. And when the highway was built, they were thinking we were going to keep going up, but we actually started to descend. So we can actually live without the highway. We have these arterial roads that will be sufficient to get people and have people traverse throughout the city. However, DOT, like I said, they were like, why don't we just take a portion of the highway and put a cap over it? This is what we think would be grass. We'll put a cap over it between these two streets of Sydney and Best. And then on top of this, we actually will, on top of this cap, we'll put some trees and it'll be great. And this will reconnect this portion of the city. But the thing about it is that's only a small, tiny portion. And also it eliminates the other portion of the highway. So it's not completely a full remedy. In addition, that highway capped kind of situation will bring about other aspects that are just as deleterious, if not more. So this is like a cross-sectional view of what the DOT was saying that they would do. However, when you do this, it's not going to address many of the other issues that came about because of the highway's placement. When it's constructed, it's going to have more truck and car exhaust. Like I said, it doesn't address the entire community. So it leaves out the fruit belt community that's north of where they proposed to put this. And it wasn't going to use local employees to actually construct it. But also, most importantly, it's not going to reconnect the Delaware the North Park, which is now called Delaware Park, and then the southern part, the other park, which is now MLK Park. So it wasn't going to kind of create the vision that Olmsted had first laid out. In addition, we found that there was going to be significant air pollution from the portal ends of the tunnel. And so this is just from PM 2.5. This is not all of the pollutants. This is just some of the deleterious impacts that would increase as a result of exposure to particulate matter 2.5. And also it would cause premature death. So it was not a great solution. And so what happened was we had communities, and I started to become a part. Now I'm a board member, but I started to work with Eastside Parkway's community to kind of figure out, well, what could we do? And we ended up bringing a lawsuit against DOT. And what was interesting, we didn't bring a lawsuit because of like these health issues or because of the other issues that I mentioned. We actually brought a lawsuit because Department of Transportation failed to do a full environmental impact statement. They almost did, like, I call it the Cliff Notes version of reading the book. And so they basically said, oh, this should be good enough. We just did an environmental assessment as opposed to the full impact statement. And so the lawsuit was predicated on that. And then we eventually won the lawsuit. And basically now DOT has to go back to the drawing board and restart everything in terms of what to do with the expressway. And what I like about this is they're like saying, okay, we got to start fresh, but we also will even consider a potential fill-in option. So that was something that to me was a wonderful win, particularly when you're looking at efforts from a grassroots organization and other residential plaintiffs who actually were part of the suit. So I have this ongoing, it's called this plan in terms of listening, and it's called Queen City Forward. And they have these listening sessions. They just had one today. So there's these listening sessions that they have going on where people can go and talk about what they really want. Like, do you want a full decommissioning of the highway? Do you want the highway? Do you want the cap as it was already proposed? Like, so they will really listen to the people and hear what they want in terms of the future of their city. Me, as someone who believes very much in reparations, and when I say reparations, reparations can come in many different forms. And I think one of the issues is that when people hear reparations, they think, oh, you're just going to cut somebody a check and it's just immediate compensation. But when I think about reparations, I think about it coming in many forms, and one of them is environmental. And with environmental reparations, it's really about first acknowledging the harm that was done, first acknowledging the wrong, and then saying, okay, you know what, we're going to do a full restoration. But when you acknowledge it, you acknowledge it in this case that this was environmental racism. There's many different types of environmental justice, but when you have an injustice that's environmental and it falls along racial lines, then it is environmental racism. And so when that's acknowledged, then you can say, you know what, we're going to give a full restoration. We're going to try to make you whole again. We're going to try to put it back to the way it was. And then we promise that we won't do it again. And when you do all of those pieces, it's not a matter of just cutting a check. It fulfills everybody, not just the East Side. It fulfills the whole city. And that's how, in my opinion, you truly achieve environmental justice. So this is a photo of what DOT had formally proposed. Like I said, you can see how it's not even fulfilling the whole, but you still have this whole park expressway. And it was this tiny little tunnel. It was actually three-quarters of a mile. But if you do a full reparation, you could have something beautiful the way Olmsted envisioned, where you have this beautiful parkway that goes 2 miles long again. And so, like I said, I'm writing a book about this, expected to publish late next year. And I want to thank you for your time. And I've used up 46 minutes exactly. So I have time for questions. I'm going to stop sharing so I get to see folks.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts, for a fascinating presentation. I was really taken up by your how you coined the term environmental reparation is not always cutting the check. Okay, I'm going to open up the Q&A for the whole audience here. So here you have the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask the question directly. I did see a hand from Trisha. or that? Oh, maybe before we start, we do a round of applause for a fascinating talk for Dr. Roberts. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Um, questions? If not, I'll go ahead with one. During your qualitative interviews, as you were talking with the people around the park in the city of Buffalo, did you come across this NIMBYism, not in my neighborhood concept? Was there anything back and forth with that? That's been a lot talked about in urban renewal, urban design, in different kinds of neighborhoods.
Um, well, not in the sense of the way we hear about NIMBY, because I was targeted to people who had lived there and who were on the receiving end of the parkway being destroyed. So what I basically, and I want my inclusion criteria was anybody who was at a minimum age 68, 70 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, you could have lived anywhere in Buffalo, but I would have liked you specifically to live on the east side, and which ultimately they did. And so you have people talking about what they remember about the parkway. You have people also talking about things that I had always thought happened, but they didn't articulate it the way that I had thought it. Meaning they were like, yeah, like one woman said, my dad had bought the house. I mean, and she was saying we were so excited to move on Humboldt Parkway, and then once we moved there, we all of a sudden realized, like we were so excited because it was this opportunity to get into this area that was transitioning. Because before it was very much populated by Jewish immigrants and German immigrants. Also, two groups that were not favorable, but that's why it had got that area was very yellow. And so when you had a lot of Black people transitioning in there, they were like, this is a great area and it's a beautiful area. And they were like, wow, we finally have this chance to get in here. And so you had these stories, this one particular woman saying, yeah, my dad, after he bought the house, and all of a sudden he realized he's hearing that, oh, there's actually going to be a highway. So from what my understanding is, I feel like there was some essence of blockbusting occurring because there was a lot of talk about, yeah, it was like a rapid kind of like purchase. Like people were leaving in droves, but we had these opportunities. So I feel like there was some targeting in terms of like it was telling Black residents, hey, come on in, you get this opportunity to come in here, because there was already some rumblings about the possibility of this highway going in. Because people were saying, yeah, that all of a sudden you just started seeing construction. So I think there was a lot of people who just kind of just didn't necessarily know, unless you were the people who needed to know, so to speak. Well, no, the people who needed to know didn't know, but the people who were doing it were the people who knew. And then you heard other great stories about people saying how they used to love to play on the parkway and how they would go to the science museum because there's a science museum right next to the park. And it was wonderful to do this walk. So you had a lot of really wonderful stories about when they experienced the parkway. But it was just nice to hear people's stories.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Keith, you have a hand up and you also pasted the question. Do you want to read out your question?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. So I just wanted to let you know that there's about 20 of us watching your presentation. So I'm teaching a graduate course on chronic illness, and last week we talked about social determinants of health. So we all listened in to your wonderful presentation today.
Oh, great. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, I'm going to try to let's see. I'm going to turn the video on. Hopefully you can see everybody. Can you see everyone?
Hi, everyone.
Okay.
Hi.
So the question was from a student, And he asked, what is the role of the Parks Department and cultural institutions in rebuilding these green spaces?
Well, they're proponents of it. It's interesting. They're proponents, but they're also, so we have something in Buffalo called the Buffalo Olmsted Conservancy. So I'm also a board member of that. But it's a very tenuous type of organization in the sense that we do receive some funding from the state. And with that funding from being linked to the state, you also are linked to the fact that it's the New York State DOT who's trying to push to keep the expressway. So on the one hand, we're vocal about the fact that we want to, restore the parkway fully. But on the other hand, we can't, we have to kind of ride a fine line between promoting it and kind of being like this activist, so to speak. But for now, they're not really doing anything. I mean, they're there to take care of all the other parks and keep the other parks in pristine condition. But in terms of Humboldt Parkway, they're kind of like waiting on the bench right now to see what will happen. And the main players that are engaged in this kind of argument right now are New York State DOT and the governor and the residents of Buffalo. Hopefully that answered some of your question.
Yeah, thank you. There's another student that would like to ask a question. Is that okay?
Uh-huh.
Yes, please go ahead. Then I'll go to another
Okay, sorry.
audience.
Okay.
No
Lydia.
worries.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So my question is along the lines of the active living inequity. So part of the people that were engaged, the participants that were engaged in your research, you said were 60 and above. So I'm assuming those were residents who lived during that time where the parks were a thing. And thinking of like if the DOT is able to halt and stop and build the parks now with the new generation who did not live with the parks, what are some plans or interventions you see possible to encourage active living within the younger generations who were not used to having that amount of parks in here?
Yeah, no, great question. Great question. So in active living research, there's always kind of been this thought, well, and that's also been substantiated by empirical research, that if there's a park there, people will go. So it's almost like if you remove an expressway and you put in a parkway, you will have people who are like, you know what, maybe I can actually walk to the store, or maybe I can actually bike. And then also campaigns to encourage people to do it. Campaigns where you might have something where you have a discount on ride or bike share programs, or campaigns where you're like, we'll do a walkathon, things to kind of get people to get back out there and say, okay, you know what, I can do this. This is something that is viable. And also, I think a lot of things that increase bikeability and walkability for people is bringing up the destinations for people to go to. So it's not just about the increase of active living, it's also bringing back those small businesses. So bringing back the coffee shops, bringing back the little mom and pop, stores and things that people can actually walk to or bike to. And I think that will also encourage people. And you need a little bit of disincentive. So you take away the parking. So when you take away the parking along the street, you put in a protected with a bike lane with a barrier, people will grumble a little bit and they're like, there's no parking on the street. But you'll have people who are biking. They're like, well, I have this wonderful wide bike lane. So there's kind of ways to incentivize and disincentivize people to get to the point where they start to be much more walkable and bikeable. Then the third thing is people who are like, okay, I'm not really into biking or walking. There's also been thought of or push to be like, why don't we institute a light rail line or an extension of the light rail line that we do have? So if you have that, you'll have people who are like, well, I'll just kind of like maybe park and ride at this light rail line, or maybe I can even walk up to the light rail line and then kind of transport myself that way. So there's two different pieces. There's the active recreation piece for the people who just want to bike and walk for leisure, but then also for transport. And so we were trying to encourage like the physical activity for all of those things. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you. I have a question from Alec. Alec, do you want to ask the question directly, or you want me to read it out?
Yeah, I can ask. Hey, Deb. So yeah, fantastic presentation, Dr. Roberts. Really enjoyed it. And so Treme neighborhood in New Orleans, one of the first affluent Black neighborhoods in the country, went through a very similar disruption at the same time. And I was kind of curious if there's been any resources or researchers who have looked into all the neighborhoods nationwide that have faced or were disrupted by the interstate highway system and like the health disparities that were associated with that.
Yeah, I mean, we do have someone on our team who has kind of used that. And actually, those were some of the arguments that were put in terms of the need, the legal arguments for the need to actually do the environmental impact statement, looking at some of these other cities, because there's many different case studies throughout the United States that, like you said, in Tremont, and then there was another one. I feel like it's Ohio, but there were other cities that we have used to see almost like blueprints, but blueprints for okay, look at these are some of the implications for when you have the highway placed here, not only the economic implications, the social implications, the public health implications. And then we've also looked at cities that are like, look, this is what happens when you can remove a highway. These are the things, these are some of the benefits. So we have looked at that for comparison and for ways to kind of push our agenda for decommissioning the highway. Because it's not, like I said, Buffalo's not unique. We saw this throughout all the United States. There was actually a really wonderful article that I think it was Bloomberg News that published. It was a photo that showed all of the cities. It would show, and then they showed in color who lived in the city, and then they would show these are the cities that the highway went through. And there was at least like 8 or 9 cities that showed this. It was, but yeah.
Mhm.
Mm.
Thank you. Other questions? Maybe one last question. Maybe I get to ask the last question. So, in my understanding of the literature, the accessibility to green space also has a layer with not having a nearby green space is not accessible because there could be crime and barriers like a highway, exactly the way you say. Have anybody in your collaboration or research team has put the layer of crime to see how that comes with the green space and parks?
So we have seen that in DC where you have similar to food deserts, you have play deserts or recreational deserts. And what we see is that particularly in Ward 7 and Ward 8, I don't know if anyone's been to DC, but those are the two southeast wards. Those wards are 95% Black residents. Those areas have what we call as recreational deserts. And it's because the fact that even though you have after hours access to the park space or playground space and green space associated with schools, and then you also have other park areas, the map shows that when you overlay that, those areas are buffered around a very high incidence of murders, a very high incidence of robberies. So that's why, even though you have the facilities,
Mhm.
people are not going to go. So there has been research showing that and how that is a barrier to going to areas. And then it doesn't even have to be that extreme. It could just be areas that are again disinvested. Like you may have syringes and other aspects
Mhm.
free at parks that are just not kept up. So people are not drawn to it. And so you see that as a barrier for people going to parks as well.
Mhm.
But yeah, we've seen that.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. So that this is where we complete our fascinating webinar and Q&A. If from the audience, if you have other questions that you would like, Dr. Roberts have graciously said that she will be willing to receive emails about and for any of your questions in the future. So
Yep.
thank you again, and for another round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for your attention.
Thank you.